Hello everyone, welcome to your tutorial for your shoe still life in shape and value. There are a few new tools I would like to cover with you. It'll be your transparency tool, your gradient tool, and the effects for a softening of the edges for a Gaussian blur effect. You should be pretty well acquainted with managing and moving your layers, and we'll talk about individual objects or shapes and how we can arrange those objects so you can bring them to front, bring them to back, and group different objects as well. So let's get started. Here in this photograph, you have a foreground shoe, the red shoe. The two black shoes are in the middle ground, and then the background you could think of as the carpet and the wall. So over here in my layers palette, I have a foreground, a middle ground, and a background. I'm just going to turn on everything so you can see how things have roughly started to be put in. The goal of the drawing is to get you acquainted with seeing value, understanding how light moves and changes direction as it hits an object. So you'll be incorporating several different shadows from your light source in your setup, as well as thinking in terms of contrast and detail. Objects closer to my eye will have more contrast, more detail, and things farther from my eye will have less contrast and less detail. So keep these things in mind as you choose the different shades of gray you're going to use. And here in your swatch palette, there'll be a grayscale setup, and these are 10 basic steps of gray. When you double click on one, the slider will open and you can alter it as well. You could have increments in between, 70 and 80, you could have 75. And I'll say okay and just close out of that. Another tool you're going to use is your transparency tool. By using one of the shades of gray, then overlapping it on another shade of gray, but then changing the opacity, you can create different grays. So you can have a wide range of grays. For example, if on my foreground, I will hold down my shift key and I have these two shadows selected. And if I change the opacity of the shadows, you can see how they had gotten darker here. And then this core shadow, if I want it much darker, I've created a much darker shadow here. By having more contrast in the foreground, away from the main shape that's going to be my foreground shoe, it'll appear that this whole foreground area moves closer to my eye. Also notice here on the edge the shadows curve around the middle ground or black shoe there. And all your shadows will have a darker core towards your object and a lighter core away from the object. Now this shadow that's back here on the background layer, you'll notice there's a gradient in there. There's something a little more subtle about moving the value light to dark, and you'll notice there's an error here too, that it's overlapping the shoe where it should not overlap. I'm going to unlock that layer, and for my middle ground I made two different layers. Each shoe is on its own individual layer. That might be a good strategy for you as you build layers on top of layers, shapes on top of shapes. Make as many layers as you need to get the detail and depth that this assignment requires. When I select this shadow shape and I see that it needs to go behind the shoe, if I go under Object, Arrange, I can send it to back. Now when you go into these different menus at the top, remember you can learn your keyboard commands. They're off to the right hand side. But what I really want you to understand is you're arranging shapes. You're putting some shapes on top of others to create depth. So here, this shadow is now behind this shoe, and that makes more visual sense than if I go object, arrange, bring to front. Well, now that little piece doesn't make any sense. So Command Z. All right, now in this shape, I've used the gradient tool, and that's this tool here. It's also over here on your left hand side if that's where you have your tools set up, but the gradient palette is also over here as well. And always keep in mind there's more than one place to find just about every tool in our Mac work environment here. Now this gradient, you'll see these sliders. I can double click one of the boxes, and when I do that I can change color. If I was using the color palette, I could drop different colors in there. But I'm really just using my gray, so I'm just going to add a little bit of gray to that shadow so that that white's not quite so harsh. Okay? Maybe right there. Then this other slider, I could add a little bit of dark to it if I wanted. See how that edge got a little darker? Also, when I move these, see how I can add more gray and remove. See? So depending on how I want to move this, the angle of the gradient is very important as well. I can change the angle within this box as well. So away from the shoe, it's a little darker out here. Well, I think I want it darker closer to the shoe. So here I want it darker, and maybe out here it could fade away a little bit. And I can make it even a little more subtle. I could maybe make it a little less angled. There. So this shadow could get a little lighter as it goes to that shoe. I don't think I want it quite that light. Doesn't seem to make visual sense. I better activate it. There we go. Yeah, that's probably going to work for me. And I could even make this just a smidge darker as well. All right, that might work. And the other thing I could do to this shadow, just to soften it a little bit, is I can go under Effect, Blur, and a Gaussian blur is going to make it around all the edges for me. And the more pixels I choose, the softer the edge. So here it's very soft. When I click away, you can barely detect the edge. And perhaps I might like that. For now, I'm going to leave it. And I'm going to come back to my foreground shadows. My foreground shadows, to me, look a little flat and a little clunky. Excuse me. So what I'd like to do with those is add a little less opacity and make them more transparent so that some of the other shapes can show through a little bit more. And on the core shadow, if I go back under Effect, Blur, and select Gaussian Blur, and again say Apply New Effect, I can increase the pixels, and if I click on Preview, it'll even show me what I've just done. So I can check it and then say OK and click away. Now I've made it way too subtle. So I'm going to make it less opaque. Perhaps it's still a little too subtle, and maybe I could just darken it a little bit. So I have a little darker core and a little softness there. So I'm going to leave those two shadows like that. So I've softened the shadows. Now, what I'd like to explain is object arrange. I'm moving this shoe off to the side. My foreground shoe, I want to move that big shape. I'm just going to move it to a different part of my drawing. And I'm going to turn my other eyes off so I can go back to my original shoe here. Okay? And what I want to show you is within the shoelaces, these smaller shapes, I had grouped them. And I went under Object, Group, so that I could, in effect, draw them and then put the big shape underneath. So I have this shoelace shape. This is just a translucent layer to add gray to this big flat shape, so that would show the shadow where the tongue of the sneaker would be. So this one shape is sitting right there to depict those shoelaces. If I go under Object Arrange, I could send it backward, and well, I was going to show you how to put it behind that gray value. See how the gray value overlaps it now? I'm going to do Command Z. And I'm looking for my little shapes. I don't know where they are. Oh, there they are. I found them. So, let's put the drawing back together. I want that shadow in there. I want this shape here. I'm going to nudge it with my arrow tools on my keyboard. These I've grouped together so I can place them on the edge of my shoelace. And I'm going to put this big shape back, like so. Now, if I arrange it so it comes to the front, it'll obscure everything. If I say arrange, send backward, it'll go back one or two steps. See how that little shape just showed up? And I can just keep sending it back step by step, depending on how many shapes I had layered. I can go ahead and send it all the way to the back, but then I'll have to grab my shadows. There they are. I can actually group my shadows together. So now those two shadows will stay. See if I hit delete, but then if I hit Command Z, they're there. But I can arrange and send them to the back. So they'll be behind my shoe. And then I'll turn all my layers back on. So basically what you need to do is think very carefully of what shape is in front of another shape. You can move your shapes around very easily to get back to your original photo so you can see exactly what you need to draw. You can manage your layers by turning the eyes on and off. Your color palettes, here under swatches, this neutral set of grays works very well. Or you could click here under your color guide and you can show the whoops, I turned it off. Different selections. Now here, this is all about color, chroma. We're going to do that in another assignment. There's many different color palettes that you can choose from. We want to show tints and shades. That's what you want. You're not going to use bright colors yet. We're working in grayscale, just tones. And you're trying to see how light travels around your shoes to try to build up as much detail as possible. The big shapes of the shoes would give you the raw overview, the raw outline of the shoe. Then look within each shoe and look for detail and think about the shapes you need to draw and what kind of value you need to apply to them in order to build the shapes up from what's underneath, like the solid area of the shoe, to the dotted lines and to the different grays that you see. So any questions, please email me, but that's it for this particular tutorial. Thank you.